Welcome to Beyond the Now, which is the podcast for the North East and North Cumbria Integrated Care Board. I'm Sam Allen, the Chief Exec of the Integrated Care Board, and I'm really delighted to be joined by a formidable leader here in the North East, Leslie Powell, who we'll say a little bit more about in a moment. This podcast is all about exploring leadership and particularly having the opportunity to talk to leaders and to understand how they lead with vision, purpose and impact. So Leslie, thanks a lot for joining us today. Let's just have a conversation, I think it'd be fair to say, but I'm really grateful for you giving up some of your time to talk to us in health, particularly about your role in education. You're Chief Executive of the North East Learning Trust, which is heading up a series of academies here in the North East. And I wonder if we could just kind of start by just hearing a little bit more about the North East Learning Trust and your role in it.
So I'm the CEO of the North East Learning Trust. The trust originated from Shotton Hall. I arrived there in 2005 as deputy head, and it has built from there. With 13.5 schools, it's always a strange one. People say 0.5 a school, but we co-sponsor an SEMH school with Eastern College. And that's been a tremendous success and something I'm going to talk about later. And we have another 3 schools on top of that who we are supporting and who will eventually join the trust, hopefully. So we've got quite a lot going on. We also operate outside of just the classroom, if you like, in that we have a teaching school hub. We have a research school. We have an attendance hub. And we have, we've been a trainer of teachers at scale for a considerable number of years. We had a school-centred initial teacher training institution, which was SCIT. We work with the National Institute of Teaching. We're the founding college in the region for that organisation as well. So we do a lot of system-wide work as well as working within our own schools. And that is a really interesting mix because it keeps us at the cutting edge of development and the work that's going on in education. It allows us to think really deeply about the work we're doing both in the classroom and the messages that we're given externally, because of course if they don't align, that way lies the route to mayhem. But it also allows us to work with other schools and leaders, and you always learn from that, which is extremely productive as well. For myself personally, I was also an inspector with Ofsted from 2008 until last summer, so a good long stint doing that sort of work, which was extremely productive in terms of my own professional development. And I was also a national leader of education, working to support other schools on their journeys around the region. And we currently work supporting trusts as well. Actually, sometimes outside of the region, we're working with a trust in Nottingham at the moment, interestingly. So yeah, we're busy. It's varied and really very interesting. And I think I'm incredibly fortunate to have the role I have. In 37 years, I've never had a day when I hadn't wished I'd been a teacher. You know, my choice of profession has been absolutely the right thing for me. I have loved my job at every stage of my career, and I actually absolutely love the job I have now. It gives me great opportunities. And
you get that real strong sense. I think it's the third time I've met you, and I've always sort of bowled over by your passion for young people, but also the profession as well. So really curious. So it started in 2005 and at Shotton. Yeah. And the 13 and a half schools since then have sort of all come since you started there. Yeah. And just tell us a little bit about the last sort of 20 years.
Okay, well, 20 years ago, we moved back from Manchester. It's interesting when I think about, I was thinking about today and thinking about my career. And really, somebody once said to me a few years ago now, Leslie, I'd really like to be able to see into your head so I could see what your 5-year plan is. And I remember laughing to myself and thinking, you'd be really disappointed because I haven't got one. I've never had what I would call a grand plan. But I am driven, I'm competitive. I'm interested in my own learning. I'm interested in new things, wanting to be better at things, develop myself further. And I'm interested in making a difference. I grew up in a household where a mum and dad who the expectation is if we could help others as we went along, we should. It was our duty to do so. And also a household where, we talked about social injustice. We talked about, the most vulnerable in society, political with a small p, if you like, but a lot of thinking about opportunity and meritocracy and giving other people's chance to fulfill their potential in reality. So I am really passionate about that. Our children are as good as anywhere. Absolutely believe that with a passion, which is why we have strong academic curriculums. We don't we don't think our children should be any different to anybody else, with really strong outcomes. That's really important. But the development of the whole child, I think, is particularly important when you serve in areas of disadvantage, and that really drives me. That passion and that trying to pass that confidence, if you like, into our children, that you can do anything, go anywhere, be anything, and just work with us and helping them take those steps. And it brings immense pride when you see children and whole families and generations. Once you've got a few years under your belt, you start to see the children of some of the people. So the last 20 years, I think we've gone from one school, Shotton, which was struggling when I arrived. We had double outstanding by 2013. At that point, I do get bored. And it's never boring running a school, but it can be repetitive. And I was thinking, well, what next? There was a lot of political change going on at that time and nationally. Obviously, the academy movement was starting. We'd added the teaching school and we were adding the skit. We took Brownie. And I came to a real crossroads, I would say, around 2014. And I think quite often you're so busy you motor through crossroads and you don't even realise you've done it sometimes. But this one I felt really conscious of. We'd got too big to be a school. Shotton was too big to be a school, but not big enough to be a trust at that point. And I knew I had to make a decision that we either expanded and became a trust and developed further, or we joined somebody else. I felt at a real crossroads. My concern at that point was I felt very thinly spread. I think I'm much more conscious of quality at scale now. I think it was probably unconscious at the time, but I was very aware that, how do we sustain what we have? It was really important that Shotton continue to develop and innovate and be the fabulous school that it remains to this day, whilst at the same time doing other things. So I had a real conundrum around that time. And at that time, Easington Academy joined us, brought capacity, and Tony Spurs became my deputy. I also appointed a second deputy, Janice Gorlach, and I built the capacity that I knew we were going to need if we were going to support other schools meaningfully. So I've never been interested in just growing the trust for the sake of it. We've turned schools down. I'm not interested in being large but poor performing, for example. I'm not interested in having real inconsistency across the trust. So I always say to schools, if you're choosing to join us, we're close relations, we're not distant relatives with one another. And obviously, a lot of the schools that have joined us have come to us at their lowest ebb, inadequate, often in challenging circumstances, and really needing help and support. I get a lot of personal and professional pride, if you like. I don't know if it's the right word, but pleasure. The difference we can make to those schools, to those staff, to those children, and to those communities is meaningful, and that's great professional, obviously, recompense for the work that you do, if you like.
Yeah, so there's a few things in what you said that I just kind of want to explore a little bit. Firstly, a kind of personal reflection. When you were challenged around what's your 5-year plan, if I could just get in your head, and I think your response was something along the lines of, well, I haven't got one. Yeah. I do quite a lot of work around women in leadership, and I often find this is a really strong trait in women, and sort of women that are successful aren't necessarily driven by having a master plan and something out there. I just wondered whether you see any of these traits in women leaders, or how you're inspiring the future leaders to think a bit more visionary about the future and where they want to get to.
Yeah, I think it's a combination of things. I think my own career has been intertwined with my life. My children. We moved back from it. My dad died suddenly at 65, and that was the push my husband and I needed to move back from Manchester to be closer to family. So a lot of my decisions have been driven by family as much as, everything's intertwined. You can't separate the two. And I think that probably maybe a more female aligned trait, I suspect. What I see in the next generation, those working with us now, is I know some of the staff will say, well, you've raised children, had a career, so I know it can be done, sort of thing. And it's tough. It's not easy. So we do have some of those conversations, and I think you do role model some of that. But more often than not, what I see is brilliant women who just don't have enough confidence in themselves. And we've got a number of heads in place now who would be really openly say they wouldn't have done it if they hadn't known they had somebody there behind them. And I think that's the beauty of trusts. You're not on your own. In my early days, headship was a really lonely position. But I think now with the trust, you've got that group of people around you who can support you when you need it. And, it can be a very challenging role and really important. And I know now we've got some great leaders who are thriving and fantastic and contributing to the trust. But that initial step just needed an extra prod, an extra push, and you know, somebody say, "Come on, of course you can do it," and I'm there. You know, if you need me, they don't really need you, but just that they know that you're there. So I know there's a number of our heads who have said that that's given them the confidence to take the next step.
The other thing you said was 2013, when you got Shotton in 8 years to double outstanding, you knew you needed to kind of take them forward a bit more. Now, not all leaders might have that mindset. Some might say, we're the best, we're at the top of our game, we're going to kind of just stay as we are. But yeah, so the reason I'm really curious about this, because I think there are real parallels and learning for other sectors, like us in healthcare. So I just wondered if you could say a little bit more about that.
Well, the minute you're standing still, you're actually declining, for starters. You can't do that. But actually, one of the great pleasure that I get in terms of my role is developing and building capacity and seeing others blossom. So when I've done something and I hand that project on to somebody else to lead it forward, I'm never offended by the fact they make it better or develop it further. I don't want them to keep it in amber, just as I'm really excited to see another younger member of staff or the next generation taking something and just moving it forward even further. You think, wow, that's really great. You've really built from that well. So I take great pride in that, and I'm not. I don't find that challenging at all. I'm quite the opposite. I'm obviously thrilled when people start to drive things forward themselves, and if you don't build that capacity, you're going nowhere. You know, the job as a head teacher is not just to run your school. But I shouldn't need to be on site for the school to run. And similarly with the trust, if you build something so that it all falls apart if you're not there, then you haven't built it well enough. So it's really important that you're building capacity and the next generation of leaders who are able to make decisions without you holding their hands all of the time. And that's a bit about confidence, isn't it? You've got to create environments where if you get something wrong, the world doesn't end. Because if you don't want to get things wrong, you never try anything. We've all done it. And you think, wow, I won't do that again. But you've got to create, obviously within parameters, but you've got to create an environment where people can learn, grow and thrive and start to build that capacity. And I think that's absolutely critical. And for me personally at that time, obviously I remain immensely proud of Charlotte's a fantastic school, but the new head there now, Alex Hook, is fantastic, and she's picked that school up and took it even further forward. We got our third outstanding last summer, and that continued high sustained level of excellence in that school is really critical for that community, as well as for us as a trust. And it's a hotbed of innovation, and it's really important that as a leader, not only did I think, well, what do I want? But I'm building an organisation that is sustainable in the longer term, with or without me.
Yeah. And I think correct me if I'm wrong, but the Learning Trust, you've got a particular skill in going into and supporting what the public might have heard were failing schools in some areas of high deprivation and disadvantage. And again, just thinking about the parallels with the NHS, when we hear about scandals or difficulties in organisation, I was struck though about how passionately you talked about, in a really aspirational way, the strengths of those communities, your pupils, your staff. And I just wondered, and I think this is really important for us in healthcare, about when you support and work alongside schools as part of the trust, where do you get that tipping point of a place being seen and talked about as failing to being seen more positively and aspirationally? And what's the role of your leadership and the leadership of the trust in that?
I mean, it takes time. Even when things are miles better, it's interesting how long it can take to change perception. And we often find it takes despite parents' day-to-day experience changing radically, it sometimes just takes that office inspection to put the rubber stamp on it in some schools, not in others. I think the critical thing we've learned over time is you don't change a school from the outside. So I've worked as an NLE, National Leader of Education, where I'm given a contract from the DfE, and you support schools and you can help, but you can't really make change. You're not accountable for anything. Whereas when schools join our trust, we have a one trust mantra, and that's really important. So as a trust as a whole, we're only as strong as our weakest member. And all of the staff will flood and support a school in distress or going through a difficult time. And we have staff who we can move around to support. And that's both at heads level, but also much lower down as well, right? At subject director level and classroom teacher level. We help and support one another because we see each other as serving the needs of all of the children in our trust, regardless of of which school they actually attend. You don't improve and turn a school around unless you're on the ground. And that's the lesson we've really learned. And the other thing we've really learned is around communication and messaging and training and development. It's an easy mistake to think you've got a change when you've actually got superficial compliance. Right. And you've got small improvements being misinterpreted as large improvements, because in the school it feels huge, even though it's really not in the scheme of things. So what we've learned is it's really important for leaders to be on the ground, and that's myself and my deputy Tony, and very hands-on. I'm probably in my office once a week sort of thing. I spend most of my life in schools, as does she, working with leaders and shaping the thinking and modelling, walking, even just to walking the corridor. I'm a heat-seeking missile for a naughty child. I seem to just find them without even trying.
They find you?
Well, no, I think I find them. I just there's an ability to pick out the naughtiest child in the school just by walking around the corridors. But we model and walk the walk, and because I've been in this game for a long time, I've actually done most of the roles in the school. I understand at a basic level the different roles in a school at the majority of levels. So we will roll our sleeves up and put our shoulders, if you like, to the wheel. We don't sit somewhere else, and we don't think of a school as separate. We think of it all as one huge family's a bit trite, I know, but we're one group of people working to achieve an aim, and it's a lot of work to break down the walls sometimes, because you come into an adequate school and people are professionally devastated quite often. A lot of schools in challenging circumstances that we pick up, what you find is there's great care for the children, but they've become swamped in it. Mm-hmm. And we know safeguarding and all the rest of it is an enormous role that schools carry out, and it's massively increased in the last 10 or 15 years. But sometimes people think this is controversial, but it's hard to believe. We are there to educate. That is our primary function. We are not childminders. Nothing else that we do, as important as it is, overrides the fact that we are there to educate. And if we don't give these children the knowledge, skills, the attributes they need when they leave us, then we have done nothing for them. It's not just our job to love them for 5 or 6 years or however long they're with them. We must equip them with that. Many of them have no safety net. Not all, but many of them have no safety net. And if we don't do it that one shot they've got, nobody else is going to. And so we keep a real laser-like focus on the importance of our key role. So, and it can sound a bit like tough love at times. I always say we have to be ambitious for our children while we teach them to be ambitious for themselves or to aspire for themselves. And sometimes they don't like you very much when you're doing that. They're not great fans while you're doing that. And sometimes even families find that their own expectations of their children sometimes are not quite where they should be or could be, and that's a confidence thing quite often.
So there's a real honesty. Because in the health service we talk about compassionate leadership, and sometimes that's confused as being weak. It's all about kindness, but actually compassionate leadership, it's the truth telling. It's also talking about, with real honesty, some of the really difficult stuff as well, with a kind of a shared purpose of improvement in mind.
And that's all about trust and relationships. But often I will say to a leader, lead. The staff don't want to watch you prevaricate over a decision and take a vote. That's not what you're there for. They want you to lead and show leadership. Heads need to exercise their directive function at times, and they need to do it with kindness and compassion, but nevertheless they need to do that to drive the organisation to where it needs to be, and it's a fine line. But I think it's critical, because without that you're not going to get change, and it's not just about change. We don't go for quick fixes. We go for sustained root and branch change of every element of the life of a school. And in an inadequate school, quite often staff may have not had good CPD for many years. They are de-skilled. They feel low, really down, and they've lost that sense of belief in themselves, let alone in the children. So, we'll walk in and say, well, actually, we're getting 100 grade 9s over there. Why aren't you? And they go, don't be ridiculous. Our children can't do that. Yes, they can. Yes, absolutely they can. We just need to figure out how we achieve that.
So this bit about superficial compliance and little improvements not being kind of misinterpreted as large improvements, because I think, again, there's so many parallels with healthcare. We have inadequate provider organisations, and that sort of sense that it can be turned around really quickly. In your experience now, which is significant, what sort of time period are you kind of thinking of going in, kind of wrapping your arms around people, moving people through a process? How long does it take?
My honest opinion is it takes 5 years to truly transform a school. We are inspected after 3 years, and every single inspection we've ever had, we've gone up at least 2 grades. So they're at least good, TCL outstanding, or good with outstanding features. But I would see even that year after inspection, after that 3rd year, you see profound changes in a school. But I actually think it takes about 5 years. And our goal is always to get our schools, if I pick Ashton as an example, Ashton I think in 2024 was 192nd highest performer in the country. Ashton was an entirely inadequate school when we arrived. They are now a net contributor to the trust, as is Sacriston, as is Bedlington, and they are helping the schools we are now supporting on their journeys of improvement, if you like, which is not to say that you can take your eye off the ball. These are all challenging schools, and the critical bit is how do we ensure that we sustain quality there while we're supporting them. And I think you've got to have that hard edge. We've learned not to tiptoe around quite so much. I think we were slower when we first started doing this. Now we're saying to the staff, this is just not right, but come with us. We'll train and develop you while we show you how to do it, while we're doing it for you, and then we'll gradually hand that back over to you. And the vast majority of staff respond to that really, really well. Some people who don't want that will go, and that's their choice. But the vast majority of staff actually respond really well to if you're really honest with them, I think, and straight. So we tiptoe less, we're more confident saying, we know how to do this, let us show you. And what we do is we have, we walk a fine line between autonomy and alignment. In an inadequate school, there's no autonomy, there's very little autonomy. We know how to do all these things, and this is how we do it. As you grow and develop and become more confident and more productive, then actually you'll have some decision making that you can make. But we tread that line really carefully, because what I don't want to do is crush creativity. I don't want to crush capacity building, innovation. I think it's really, and I know I personally would have not wanted to work in an institution where my ideas, thoughts, or trying out things wasn't welcome. So we're really careful at our trust musts, if you like. So we have our trust musts, and we have what we call additionality. Our trust musts will create a very good school. So it's a floor almost, and obviously around compliance and regulation. But the additionality allowed school to have their own personalities and their own flares within their community. And I think that's really, really important.
That ownership being really important, and they're not being done to, they're being, it's with them.
A really simple example would be, for example, the personal development curriculum, really important, or the behaviour curriculum. So we all work together and agree on the commonality of what must be there. But then how different schools deliver different aspects of it is up to them. So some of it, there's real flex about how much emphasis. And some schools need more emphasis on some things than others, depending on their context. So it's really important, I think, to walk that line really carefully, so that you don't crush the future, if you like, the capacity to build for the future.
Yeah. And just you talked about the importance of visible leadership. You're out there walking the corridors, you're hands-on. I don't get the sense you're doing a lot of remote working or getting people to come to you. You're walking the floor. COVID obviously had an impact, and remote working. When you sit down with a group of leaders, what are your asks of them when it comes to visibility and being visible as a leader?
All our heads largely depends if there's some initiative going on or they're doing something else, but the majority of our heads teach. I taught up until 10 years ago, maybe 12 years ago now, and those results go on the board like everybody else's. You're no different to everybody else's. My expectation is a head will model everything they expect of everybody else. So, we don't, I worked in schools in the past where, for example, a deputy head might never be in their class. It was always covered because they had a meeting. We don't do that. There's an absolute focus on education, teaching and learning, and that quality in the classroom. That excellence every day is really important to us. It is the centre of our school improvement model, and we put great focus on that. But the heads are very hands-on. They model what we model. And out and about. I don't put rules in place. I don't say you mustn't be in your office or you mustn't do this. I think they're professionals, and I expect them to manage themselves. I don't micromanage them in that respect, but I think we model what we expect, and they work on that model.
Okay. So just going back to the North East Learning Trust, and again thinking about us as a region, 2/3 of our children now living in poverty, which is it is devastating, isn't it? And I know that you've got a real kind of core mission around social mobility and giving I guess, our children and young people that are in your schools that kind of ability to thrive beyond school as well and make a contribution. I just wondered whether you could say a little bit more about that and the importance of partnerships with business and other sectors.
I think deprivation is really difficult. We strive really hard. If you were to walk around our schools, any of them really, I would say, but they don't feel deprived. We don't talk about it with the children. We don't we're not woe is us at all. We don't talk like that as staff. In fact, it's one of the first things when a school joins us is stop talking like that. I don't want to hear it. I don't want to hear it. These are the children. This is what we need to do. How are we going to get around the barriers that are stopping them being successful? Is my question. We take a very can-do attitude to things, but also really pragmatic. Shot 20 years ago when I joined, the results were really poor. And I did something that was quite revolutionary at the time, although not so much now, and that I moved away from the TA model and we moved to an entirely different model of teaching children who were vulnerable to not succeeding, shall we say, and those who are on the SEN register as well. So we've got a 20-year programme of working very differently from what would have been the traditional methodology of working with such children. That has been entirely productive and entirely focused on academic outcomes and shaping and developing the child. So I think it's important not to be frightened to innovate and accept there are different ways of doing things. As a trust, and bearing in mind we're sponsoring inadequate schools that we're adding all of the time, our disadvantaged children are achieving almost in line with all children nationally. In 2025, and some of our schools better than all children nationally and up almost as high as with other children nationally. It can be done, but you've got to be really fixated on that. And I think it's a combination of factors. You can't run a school just on a great teaching and learning policy. You can't run a school just on a great behaviour policy. You can't. It's about, I think, one of the things that's often missing in leadership training and development courses. It's about how you weave it all together into one story. And making sure that everything that you've got going on in the school is feeding in the same direction, whereas quite often in struggling schools you will see tensions between different initiatives, so you're pulling children from there to feed that, and that's actually causing a negative there. It's about thinking how does everything fit together so that everything's pushing in the right direction. And that's, I think, one of the things probably that's missing from some of the leadership and development courses. We look at school improvement initiatives as discrete pieces of work when they're not. It's got to be whole school leadership. And I think that's the little bit that's missing from the jigsaw of some of the school improvement training and leadership development that falls on.
Yeah, and I think it's even the same on healthcare, because sort of think about real assets in the community. Schools are trusted sources. I think parents still see, schools as trusted sources of information. And I think there's so much more opportunity we could do together. When we think about the kind of mental health of children and other aspects as well. Where do you see some of the bigger opportunities with health?
I mean, schools are such, drivers of society, if you like. We set the foundation stone in Mary said we nurture the whole of the community. We send children beyond the school gates with messages that only we can give them, really. So that's a great opportunity to be a vehicle for things like health and well-being. And so I think that's such a privilege actually to work in that environment. We are so privileged to have that. But we can be vehicles to shape, although it's important not to overload us, I have to say, and think we can fix everything. That can be.
There's a lot you've got to cram into a day.
But let me give you a simple example. So we've been doing some work on reading, and done a lot of work on reading as part of our research school. So we've been working with the DFE and local authorities south of the region, doing a lot of work around the delivery of reading and teaching of reading in schools. And we've also, within the Trust, done a great deal of work. One of the things we've introduced in the Trust, and it's the simplest thing that health could probably help us with, is we introduced visual acuity tests.
All right.
And in the first school we tried that in, out of 243 children, 35 children needed glasses and didn't have them. 35. We put them in a minibuses and took them down to a local opticians who very kindly then tested them for us, and we got those children glasses. Obviously at scale you can't quite be doing that, but we do the visual acuity test now in all of our schools, and we push and we tell parents and we remind them to take them to the opticians, and then the schools prompt them. And now we're even doing it in year 6 as they're coming in. So rather than picking it up later, we're trying to pick it up earlier. Now that's free. Schools can do that for free. We're not doing eye tests.
I'm thinking about oral health as well.
Well, we're thinking about hearing as well. So we're thinking of expanding that into hearing as well. So schools can do a visual acuity test without any skill whatsoever. So that's a really easy, free thing schools could do for the health service or for whoever that will screen children. And actually, if they can't see, they're not reading well, that's affecting their reading, that's affecting their their access to the entire curriculum. So a silly, simple thing like it's not silly, but it's so simple. And it's come about just linked to a reading initiative that we had as a trust as a whole. So we are eye testing all of our children now as they come into school for us, and that's just one example of a really simple thing. I think the other example, that half school we have, the health and well-being side, that is obviously very critical. The working relationship.
It's a special educational needs.
It's for mental, with children with anxiety, mental health, that, and some of the transformational work being done in that school. It's quite something to see. Children off to university. I think one girl went into medical school in the end. East Durham College, and it's the mix of schools, all materials with the things East Durham College can do, and the actual variety that's there, the small group sizes, and the well-being and health work that we do with those children has been life-changing for some of the children who go to that school. We're trying to expand it at the moment. But that also links into my own personal belief, which is another controversial one, is that no child should be in unregistered provision, is my view, my personal view. So as a trust, we do not place children in unregistered provision, which can be quite controversial at times, but it's just personally, I think that if we're going to give somebody a child to look after, then there should be some registration and quality control around that. Yeah, that's my personal view. But that's a really good example of cooperative work. We have local authorities commission places with us. That has really done some really good for some children who are pretty much invisible in the system quite often.
So, I mean, that's a collaboration with another education provider. Yes. Sort of how long did it take to get that off the ground? Did you have to make any compromises along the way?
It started off as a studio school, actually, the studio school model, and it just didn't work, as the studio schools haven't worked particularly well. And then I think we all got a few more grey hairs through the process of converting it into what it is now, with great help from some of the regional DFE staff, real great help from them. Because I think we're pretty niche, I think we're pretty unique in the country, to be honest, but it works just so well. It's just really a really strong and positive offer for, as I say, children who are perhaps less visible in the community.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier you were an Ofsted inspector, and interesting, I'm an executive review for the Care Quality Commission, and I think sort of Ofsted and the CQC have both been through some quite significant challenges recently in terms of the method of inspection. Certainly on the CQC side, delays. They've got new leadership now. They're going through quite a big turnaround, but there might be a sense that actually the whole regulatory side needs to be refocused. I mean, obviously in Ofsted there was the very sad case of Ruth Perry, who sadly took her life following an Ofsted inspection, and equally, I know, talking to peers and colleagues, the real impact an inadequate rating or a inspection that hasn't gone as well as people would expect, the impact on leaders, I think, and hearing that news. I mean, it'd just be good to kind of just get your thoughts around where you kind of think regulation is going and where the opportunities for improvement are.
I think, I thoroughly enjoyed being an Ofsted inspector. I learned loads, seeing other schools and things to do and things not to do.
That's why I did it, because you get to go and see how people do it.
We'll do that. It's really good. I think it's a symptom of the pressure the system is under. Partly, I think, we are under intense pressure in the schools, especially post-COVID. And it's about consistency and fairness and that sense of that perhaps isn't as strong as it should be at times. And it's about how do we get that right, and how do we we must have accountability. It's critical. Some of the inadequate schools we've picked up absolutely need intervention. So we must be able to intervene in schools and identify the schools that need that. And it's just how we do that in a measured way, and perhaps suck some of the heat out of it. And so that we make lives better for children and young people, but that actually it's not the end of the world for staff members at the same time. So it's a very fine line to walk, and I'm pleased I'm not the person having to figure out how to do that. But we do absolutely need accountability. There's no question around that, but intelligent accountability. And I think we've got to make some decisions, and that's for politicians, I guess, is how much do we want to micromanage a school or a hospital for that matter? How much of the inspection framework is meant to be telling schools how to operate or measuring actually what a school is doing. And I think we've got to be really careful, certainly in the school system, that we're not measuring the context rather than the school. Yeah, that's really important, because what that does is makes it much harder to recruit in the schools that need the best quality staff the most, if you like. So it's important that we don't get some of the unintended consequences. But I think leaders are well aware of that. But some consistency over time, I think.
Yeah.
And I think if staff just have a trust in the system and feel it's fair and measured, that's the way forward. And I know that's very closely being looked at the moment. Certainly in the education world, there's a lot of change in hand at the moment, trying to look at.
And again, similar in health, and so many opportunities to learn together on this. Just want to change subject a little bit and kind of maybe two different angles. Social media.
Yeah.
Social media and the impact on children and young people. And I mean, never mind children and young people, but, you know, in recent times, I've been, I think probably like many of us, slightly aghast to see some of the most powerful individuals in the world, you know, playing out poor behaviours on social media. And one of those, the leaders of one of the biggest nations in the world, I'll try and kind of cover that without mentioning names. But we know that this is, I mean, both of us kind of growing up, just we didn't have to contend with any of this. We didn't have the pressure of it. We didn't have it invading our personal spaces. It's not to say navigating relationships wasn't easy, but this just brings a whole new level for children and young people. And we see the impact of this particularly in children mental health services as well. What's your take on what we need to do about this?
I mean, you know, there's no doubt the materials children are accessing online are terrifying. There is no. I often reflect. I'm grateful my own children were sort of mid to late teens before the sort of really big advent of these sorts of resources. And I have a grandson who's 8 months at the moment, and my constant line is, "Don't give him a phone ever," sort of thing. But I think we've got to get real. There is a role around schools teaching children, but we do already. That isn't going to fix it. My personal view would, can somebody please design a phone that's illegal for anybody under 16 to have anything with with only the most basic functions on. So children are allowed a phone with this many functions on. But I know that's probably trying to hold back the tide, and I'm probably being really wishful thinking.
But there are very few safeguards in place.
There's none in reality. You know, we filter and monitor in school. Yeah. We can offer filtering and monitoring now to parents if they so desire. But we kind of police everything that, you know, but we do end up policing things that happen at weekends and overnight and on Snapchat and TikTok or whatever. I mean, I'm not an expert myself by any stretch of the imagination, but there is no question whatsoever it's having an incredibly, incredibly detrimental impact on our children and young people. There's no question it is feeding misogyny. You know, we think about the issues around violence against women and girls in society. There is no question that it's reinforcing the worst instincts of humanity and the worst behaviours. It's normalising things that are not normal in terms of behaviours or acceptable. And I think at the moment it feels like there is no control on it whatsoever, other than, you know, schools are firefighting, trying hard, as I imagine parents. But I think it would be good if there was something at a societal level that could do more about it. What that would look like, I'm not quite sure, but I am absolutely certain of the damage it's doing. Terrible. Even our primary school children now are seeing really inappropriate materials, particularly little boys' phones. I mean, the things they're being exposed to are quite horrific.
Yeah, and I suppose you see that, and many people don't even sort of realise the risk that our young people are exposed to. I think also challenging for your teams and your staff to deal with as well. We know that we've seen an increase in mental health, not just in healthcare workers and needs, but I would imagine probably in your workforce as well.
I think certainly, I know obviously our counselling service staff automatically have supervision, and we often talk about supervision for our pastoral staff. Some of the things they are dealing with are very, very difficult. I think in our bigger schools, if you like, there's such a team. I think they almost supervise each other to some extent, and we have talked about formalising that. But more often than not, we have, you know, across our schools, we have a strong group of DSLs, designated safeguarding leads, and pastoral leaders who will support one another during the most dark times. And there are some really dark times dealing with very dark issues. But I think, you know, people who choose to live their life with a DSL, I take my hat off to them. I absolutely take my hat off to
with
them.
our designated safeguarding leads.
That is a very, very difficult role. One of the things I think we probably should do is look at what is the leadership and development training for DSLs. So we have SENCO qualifications nationally, but we have nothing for DSLs. And actually I think that's probably we're a little bit behind the times there, because the degree of complexity of that role has changed without from any recognition of what it was 20 years ago in reality. But yeah, I think it is a very, very challenging and difficult role. I think people would be surprised at how much they're dealing with.
Yeah, and I wonder whether we talk about this enough in terms of the realities of the pressures and some of the choices we need to make as a public about what we're willing to tolerate and what we're not willing to tolerate, and as a society. And I think the bill that they're exploring, in particularly from a safeguarding perspective on the use of digital, I think we need to get really real about the harms that our young people are exposed to on this. Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think the changes around, children who are opting for elective home education, who are at risk, not allowing children, that is very sensible moves, very, very much needed. And the whole, the number of children in elective home education at the moment is terrifying.
In terms of the numbers?
Yeah, numbers. I've never seen anything like it in my career.
Give us a sense of what you're seeing, that difference.
If I tell you, you might see one every 3 years and you might see 3 in a week now. It's as different as black and white. It is absolutely, our schools traditionally had very, very, very few. And that varies, but across different schools, but our schools had very, very few, yet we're seeing, numbers that we think are big. And we just seem to have no power to do anything about it.
What do you think is influencing the change? Because it sounds like quite a dramatic change.
It's dramatic. I think it just post-COVID, there's been an unsettlement of the accepted tradition of sending your child to school. I think we will reap this generation, we will reap as we sow with this generation. I worry about those children and what they'll do next. Will they become the NEETs? Will they become the,
not in education, employment or training?
Sorry. I worry what will happen next. I'm hoping that after a short time, some will start to come back to us. When parents recognise that it isn't actually maybe it's going to work, but we'll see.
So this is sort of a post-COVID.
It's a post-COVID thing, yeah, where I think there's almost a sense for some that school is optional.
Yeah.
And yet, as a trust, we were really quick. Shotton in particular, but all of our schools, we had online learning up and running almost from day one. Shotton from day one. So we weathered COVID extremely well. Academically, we came out very strongly. We delivered our curriculum. We had training, we had development, we had counselling sessions, we had assemblies.
Anything you do, if we had another pandemic that required sort of similar requirement, anything you do differently?
I think online we were really strong. We were there. We had already developed a curriculum in the pocket, if you like. We had online platforms that we had built ourselves. So online we were really very strong already. I think it's really hard to say. It depends on. I think in the early days we all had to go online because people were falling like flies. The staffing numbers were falling like flies. We couldn't have staffed the school, let alone kept the children safe. But I think thinking about society as a whole, I think there was a bit of a shock at the time at how much schools actually did in terms of keeping children safe, and I think it exposed perhaps how thin the rest of the protections were around children to some extent. So I think we need to think about some of that. And just God forbid we have another pandemic, but I know history tells us we will have another pandemic. I'm not sure for us. In terms of learning, we had a very successful pandemic.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we had a very successful.
It sounds like your investment in digital was a big part of that.
And we had really fun. We were practicing at midnight in my pyjamas the week before, sort of think, can we get this thing working? And it's about, the leadership of that as well. And some of our school leaders were exceptionally talented at driving that forward.
You are quite advanced, though, on the digital and tech. And I mean, in healthcare, we've got a lot more work to do, particularly in this sort of shift from analogue to digital. I'm just curious about AI, artificial intelligence, and how you think that's going to change the future of education.
We have found, we spent a couple of years trying to buy platforms that would suit our needs, never could. And in the end, we employ 2 developers now. As well as we have staff, obviously, with those sorts of skills as well. So we have built our own platform. So Power BI, obviously, is out there. So we use that extensively in terms of our work. We've also built another system called EASY, which is Easy Access System Information around our pastoral behavioural system. And at the moment, we're looking really strongly at AI. and one looking at marketing feedback, primarily thinking of workload, because of obviously it's a high agenda thing, and we're about to launch in September. We're really excited about it because not only is it going to be a game changer, I think, for staff, but actually it's going to be better for the children. So the thing you've got to keep your eye on is that you don't innovate for the sake of it. And it is actually better. It's not just shiny and new. Do you know what I mean? And you've got to be really careful you don't turn in some things into something that's meaningless.
Yeah.
So it's not good enough for AI just to mark something for us. We need to know the mistakes that the child's made, what they need to do next, what the common misconceptions are, and we need a system that will feed all of that information to the teacher so they can use it formatively in their lesson planning. So it's really careful implementation, I think, rather than just gung-ho, just using it for the sake of it or using it to solve a problem, but actually providing the children with a worse offer that's going to not aid and support their learning. But we think we've got a little plan, a plan that we're about to trial around marketing feedback that is going to make a huge difference, and that we can see how that will stretch on into, we have context sheets for each class and it varies, so that we see how it can start to feed into other systems. We're also trialling it with some other areas of our work as well, and we're all very excited about it, but it's about making it work at scale and not losing the quality of the offer in the meantime.
Sounds like a really thoughtful approach. I like your point about don't just go after the shiny thing, make sure it works for what you need.
It mustn't diminish the quality of the learning in the classroom. So.
Very good. Quick fire round, and we're almost there. So, a book or quote that shapes your thinking as a leader.
We have a strapline, every child to experience excellence every day, and I can't remember where I read that. It wasn't me who thought that up. But
You shamelessly stole it from someone.
I shamelessly stole it from someone, but that's the mantra by which we live by. If I had to choose a word, it's Michael Fullan's simplicity. I think we give over
Simplexity. Like that.
So it's about having complex systems, but developing staff training and development through simple messages, not overcomplicating things. And I think certainly in education we are in danger at times of overcomplicating the messages of what good learning looks like and what a good classroom looks like. So simplicity is one of my little buzzwords that I think we operate at a complex level, but we do it by giving really simple messages that we train to and develop really, really well.
Love it. Our current Chief Exec of the NHS talks about radical simplicity, and it sounds like it's really similar. Yeah. What's the best advice you've ever received?
Don't take it personally. Yeah. I think that's a really...
Still hard to do though, isn't it?
Really hard to do. I'm not saying I've achieved it, but many years ago, somebody said, you don't take it personal, it's not personal. I was like, yeah, that's really good advice. Yeah.
And it really sounds like you're building lasting legacy. It just comes through so clearly in all of your kind of leadership behaviours and how you kind of talk about this, Leslie. What do you hope will be your lasting impact as a leader?
I think the privilege of being a teacher and a school leader is the impact you have on so many lives. Thousands and thousands, more than you can count over the decades, if you like. At this point in my life, what I'm thinking about is, North East Learning Trust, as it grows and expands and develops in the future without me, what I would hope it would do is to remain the high calibre, outstanding institution that it is, in that it will continue to provide excellent education for the next generation of children and more children indeed in the region, and to continue to move forward and develop and be even better than it is now, so that they continue to have that impact on our communities.
Fantastic. Now, just finally, you've just been awarded a damehood.
I know, yeah.
Well, I'm not surprised. I'm really not surprised hearing about everything that you've achieved and the impact that you've made and that lasting legacy you just spoke about, what drives you. How does it feel?
A bit surreal, I think, is probably a good way to describe it. Absolutely thrilled. But it is really a recognition of the team, of the work that the team do. Obviously, it's our job to take all of the blame. And the damehood is a nice bit of credit in return for that. But yeah, it is very much a reflection of the huge team of fantastic people who I work with on a daily basis, who do absolutely amazing work.
Yeah, well, it's just wonderful to see a colleague in the North East get that recognition nationally. It's great for the region. Absolutely. It's great for the North East Learning Trust. And thank you very much for the conversation today.
You're very welcome. Nice to talk to you. Thank you.